a morning of disruption. I'm hoping there's a word count going on right now, and we'll see how we're doing by midday. So let me introduce our panel. We're really fortunate to have a diverse group that can talk about this topic. So first of all, we have Alexa DuPont-Bell. She's the VP Business Development at Paperless Post. Brad Katsuyama, over to the side, CEO of the Investors Exchange. Byrne Doyle, right in the middle. Byrne is the VP of Strategic Growth Office at Best Buy. So we're going to hear a little bit from sort of the traditional side of industries. We have Carter Reum at the end, and he's the co-founder of M13. We're going to be talking a lot about the investor side of what's going on with disruption. And Michael Faye, co-founder of GiveDirectly and Segovia. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share some perspective about disruption first, and then we're going to sort of dive into the panel. And I want you all to know you've got the ability to submit questions. Please do so. It'll make it more interesting. It's right in the app. The questions will go to me. I'll then filter the questions and share them with our panel. So just to get started, obviously we heard quite a bit that disruption is quite common. These are big numbers. So if you search on any of these platforms, you're going to find a lot about disruption. It's probably the #1 topic right now in terms of articles being published in the business sector. So this is certainly on our minds. It's in the boardrooms. It's in the management teams. People are spending a lot of time on it. I think the question is really, what is our perspective on this? Are we fearing disruption? Are we worried about where it's going to come from? Are we trying to study it? Are we launching lots of experiments to try different things? Or are we shaping our own future? And these are two very different realities. And I'd like you just to think a little bit about the organizations you're a part of and whether you think you're more on the left or more on the right. I think we heard from Mitchell that actually people are taking advantage of the opportunities that disruption provides. But I think the reality is there's a lot of fear as well right now. So let's go through a few questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the panel. First of all, is disruption new? You'll see the picture behind me. This was a very disrupted industry, the horse and carriage space. I'm not sure the horses were terribly upset by this disruption, by the way, but the carriage industry was big. It was significant. It was a very large industry, and it essentially disappeared because of a disruption that was introduced over 100 years ago. So this is not a new thing. Last year, we were given the question, how much disruption is actually happening? And we're hearing a lot about disruption, but we wanted to understand at the business level, at the industry level, what changes were going on. We published in the Wall Street Journal an article that highlighted a whole bunch of different industries. And essentially what we looked at is how much change was happening within an industry sector. If you think about market capitalization, how much shift was there to new players or to existing players that were crossing the boundaries that we heard about this morning? And what we found is that over 39 industries that we looked at, there was only a 5% shift in that market capitalization pool. So despite a lot of technology disruption, and I'd like to separate technology disruption from business model disruption. Lots of technology disruption, not as much actual disruption in people's businesses. Now, that is not an excuse not to do anything. What it does suggest is that we have time to form the right response. The second question is, what can you do? What happens when disruption comes? So let's go back to our horse and carriage space. Many of the carriage makers were well known for saying, and we do this right now when change happens to us, they said, this is a flammable liquid near passengers. No one's ever going to buy this automobile. We obviously know what happened. But there were two carriage makers that didn't say that. There were two carriage makers that said, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're really good at things like suspension and brakes and building vehicles. The innovation, the disruption was the engine. These players are not necessarily great at all the things we're great at. Those two carriage makers did incredibly well by defining themselves by what they did, not what they sold. And that's an important lesson with disruption. If you think of yourself as a product or a service, that's going to go away at some point. If you think of yourselves as what you can do uniquely well, that gives you all types of opportunities. Now, the third question we often get is, how fearful should we be that we're right at the cusp of change and we might be affected? Because some people are being affected. And I'd like to share a story that we talk about a lot, but maybe not in this way, and that's ride sharing. We heard about Lyft and Uber, and this is sort of, I would say, the example often talked about in terms of disruption. Well, what was the industry that was disrupted? Essentially the taxi market. And you might ask yourself the question, was that a market that had a lot of advantages? And you could say, yes, there were tons of advantages to this market. Drivers are always incredibly professional and courteous, right? Vehicles are perfectly clean, modern, have all the technology, right? There were major disadvantages in this market segment. And disruptors are looking for that. And so if you sit in a sector that is an advantage, if your company is not an advantage, if you're just existing, that is when to be most concerned. Now, taxis had some advantages, right? Drivers knew where to go, but GPS came around and took that away. And the last thing that they can hold on to is regulation. But if I were running a business, that would not be the advantage that I'd be seeking for long-term strategy. So hopefully that gives you some background around the reality of what's going on in the market and what we can do about it. So what I want to do now is turn over to our panel. We have a great panel, and I think we're going to start with a question which is really, what was the story that you had in terms of really seeing disruption come, whether you actually disrupted or someone else disrupted for you? And why don't we start, Alexa, with you? And it's a good story. I think everyone will appreciate hearing it.
Great. So for those of you who don't know, Paperless Post is a software platform that facilitates online invitations for what we call people's milestone occasions. So kids' birthday parties, grown-ups' birthday parties, wedding invites, save the dates, all that good stuff. And I think when it was founded, the co-founders, in 2009, the co-founders really looked at, they weren't thinking, let's be disruptive. They were really looking at the customer need that wasn't being met. So traditionally, you could go to like a paper store and print beautiful printed invites that were lovely, but it was costly and time consuming, and you had to be really organized to do that. Or people were using the internet to send invitations or to invite people to functions, primarily with the incumbents, Facebook events and Evite both existed at that time. But what we saw as an opportunity was that for sort of two things. One, it's really, really hard to get together in the real world. It's a challenge to get everyone in a room at the same time for some sort of event that you care about. And then two, people really care about what they look like. And they really care, they want you to come to their party or the event, and they know that the invitation is the first touch point. So how Paperless Post sort of got in there and really disrupted the online invitation marketplace, we're the market leader in that space now, is that we said technology can solve the problem. Software can solve the problem. Evite's doing that well, Facebook Events is doing that well, but no one is thinking about the consumer and how they look. And so we built a design tool that let people design their own invitations, which was a very expensive build. And startup, we were the right people to do it because we were lean and we were a tech company. We had, 80% software engineers on our team. And we built it and then charged the customer. So whereas the previous business model had been ad-based, Paperless Post sold JPEGs. And a lot of the early venture capitalists were like, similar to your buggy conversation, people are never going to buy this explosive engine, right? People said, I don't want to put money in you, no one will ever pay for a JPEG. But we sort of showed that vanity wins, and people want to design something that looks beautiful and represents them, and they'll pay for it. So we figured out how to do that and grew from there.
That's awesome. It's always good to hear the insight often that starts a really amazing idea, and that insight about looking good is not what everybody was thinking about. That's cool.
But it turns out everyone here cares about it.
For sure. Byrne, let's maybe turn it over to you and maybe the other side a little bit. What was the Best Buy story that was happening in terms of the market, Amazon, others that were changing things?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Paul. So I think all of you are familiar with Best Buy, and most of you know us as a consumer electronics retailer. What we did actually 2 years ago this week, we created a strategic growth office within the company. And while that in itself isn't unique or different from some of the things that we had done in the past, the mandate of this office was a little bit different than what it had been previously. The mandate was to identify new businesses to get into as opposed to finding incremental growth, new ways to go to market, new ways to meet the customer. And one of the first things that we did was In-Home Advisor, and many of you have probably heard of the program. We started 2 years ago with 2 in-home advisors in Texas, and they were responsible for going into the home and being consultative with the consumer, trying to build a relationship, not focusing first on sales, but instead focusing on building a deeper relationship where it wouldn't just be transactional, but we'd start to think more about the lifetime value of the customer. And in a very short period of time, we've gone from 2 in-home advisors to over 400. We're now meeting the needs of consumers across the country, serving about 90% of the footprint where we have physical stores. But we also see this opportunity to go deeper into different spaces. As an example, one of the things that we're working on in the growth office is our first foray into health. We think there is a massive opportunity where health and technology intersect. That movement will also take place in the home. And we think when you start to put pieces like that together, Best Buy has an incredible platform where we have an online channel, we have a store channel with a massive footprint, but now we also have an in-home channel. And the root of what we're trying to do with all of that is meet customers where they want to be met, as opposed to trying to tell them where to meet us. So that's some of the work we've been doing.
That's great. It's another reminder as well that we all have advantages. The question is, are we taking control of those advantages? You had a store footprint. You had an ability to get to consumers in ways others couldn't. Really, sure. Really incredible. Michael, you're coming at this from a slightly different perspective in the nonprofit sector. Love to hear your story as well.
Yes, so the nonprofit sector has historically been built around the assumption that the donor or the technocrat knows best. And the donor or technocrat will make a decision. This village needs a well. That village needs textbooks. And we had reasons to think that might have been the right thing. Maybe the poor would drink the money away. Maybe they'd waste it on something silly. Well, it turns out, in the early 2000s, when we started to actually test what worked and what didn't work, a lot of the things that we as a sector thought worked, things like large-scale training programs, microfinance, just didn't have the academic evidence behind them. And this silly idea of just giving capital and choice to the recipient, to the poor, and letting them make a choice for themselves worked remarkably well. That alone was an insight. It certainly wasn't implementation. What made it possible to really implement and operate at a bigger scale was the introduction of mobile money. I think we're all used to the traditional banking footprint. The reality is that in Africa and Asia, parts of Asia, where the banking footprint has not extended to the rural areas, there was no financial inclusion there previously. The introduction of mobile money, basically the ability to be paid on one's phone, changed that. So I can now sit in this room and send a payment to people's phones across refugee camps in Kenya, Uganda, and so on. So with the evidence that giving choice and capital to the recipient and the ability and technology to do so now through mobile money, that really was the birth of GiveDirectly, which makes it possible for anyone to send capital directly to the extreme poor.
That's an amazing story, actually, with tremendous impact. Brad, you were in a very traditional space in many ways. The story around changing how people thought about that industry. Would be really interesting.
Sure, yeah, so IEX is a stock exchange. We're the newest stock exchange in America. My background was I ran a trading desk for the Royal Bank of Canada in New York, and starting around 2007, noticed that the stock market was changing pretty dramatically. I went on to run a business where I went from managing human traders to managing network engineers and computer programmers, and it turned out that these engineers knew more about how the stock market actually worked than the traders that I managed. When you turn on CNBC and you see the stock exchange floor, realize that all trades from the New York Stock Exchange get beamed out to data centers in New Jersey. And exchanges now, New York, NASDAQ, there's a third one, BATS. They own about 11 exchanges between them. They make more money selling high-speed data and technology than they do from actually matching buyers and sellers. And when you hear that, and when I learned of this, it starts to change your perception of fairness and bias in the market, because really the number one trader in the market today is high-frequency traders, which are essentially structural insiders that have bought an advantage from the exchange. So at IEX in 2012, we quit our jobs at RBC. We started IEX to basically build a stock exchange that not only did not sell a speed advantage to one participant, we actually slowed the market down by 350 millionths of a second. It's 1/1000th the speed of you blinking your eye, and it created one of the largest controversies in the market. We got lucky enough that Michael Lewis came across our story. He's written, Liar's Poker and Big Short, Blindside, and he wrote a book called Flash Boys that featured IEX, and it was on 60 Minutes. So this kind of weird, complex topic became a national discussion, and that was kind of the launching pad for IEX. We're now one of the largest global exchanges. We are bigger than the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Deutsche Börse and a number of others. And we've gone from, our first day of trading, we did 560,000 shares of trading back in October of 2013, and our record is over 600 million shares, $17 billion in a single day. So it's, we're on the path, but there's been a lot of incumbents who have tried to stop us along the way. Maybe we can get into those stories later on in this panel.
No, and I think the word lucky was a little bit generous, but all good stories typically get found, and that's certainly one of them. Carter, you've got lots of stories because you've been involved in some, you're investing in others. Love to hear maybe one of those.
Yeah, we kind of look at disruption from three angles. We've been lucky enough to invest in seed rounds and things like Ring doorbells, which are sold to Amazon, Warby Parker, Birchbox, Bonobos. We're investors in things like Hyperloop and SpaceX and Pinterest and Snapchat. And so we tend to invest in disruptors. We also recently wrote a book that hit the national bestseller list called Shortcut Your Startup. And it was really just all about kind of how you have to think about the world differently in today's day and age. And then the last thing is we kind of spend our days, we have a holding company called M13 where we're trying to disrupt the VC model. I laugh, the whole world's kind of getting disrupted around us, and most investors think they can kind of continue to invest the way they have been. For us, we really focus on kind of consumer and consumer tech, and because of some underlying trends, what we always say is there's never been a kind of bigger difference between good, better, and best. And so in e-com, just to use kind of a quantifiable stat, we show a chart that shows top quartile, second, third, and fourth quartile businesses and where they get in their third year. And so a top quartile e-com company gets to about 60 million in revenue in year 3. To put that in perspective, Kevin Plank from Under Armour was famous for it only took him 10 years to get to 100 million. A second quartile business in e-com gets to 12 million. Right, so never has there kind of been a bigger difference. And the underlying statistic there is that a 1% difference in 4 e-commerce stats is a 400% increase in sales. As Albert Einstein called the greatest invention of all time, compounding. That's how you get the difference between 60 and 12. And so we have a holding company where we think we can effectively institutionalize affecting the outcomes and accelerating consumer tech brands at scale. using a platform approach of repeatable behaviors, because we think the kind of old days of investing was about sourcing deals, and the new day is all about affecting outcomes. So, we point to Hyperloop as kind of the ultimate example of an open source idea, right? Elon Musk was a little busy with the space thing and the solar thing and the car thing, tweeted out kind of the blueprints for a Hyperloop, and then it became an execution game to kind of see who could get the capital, get the team, and start to execute. So,
maybe I'll just follow up with you, Carter, a little bit, because in the audience today, of course, we have lots of different industries here. You mentioned you focus some of the investments more around the consumer space, but as you look at different industries, why are some maybe a little bit more ready for disruption than others?
Yeah, I think there's a few common themes that you see across everything in kind of tech that's getting disrupted. I think one of the big things is kind of industries where tech enables something that was kind of previously inaccessible to become accessible. So we've invested in a company called Headspace Meditation. So for most of us here in New York City or LA, if we want to go meditate, we could probably figure it out. For my aunt in Michigan, previously that seemed kind of like something foreign to her, right? And so Headspace is a great example of something that's taken something inaccessible and made it accessible using technology. You talked about it earlier. I think any industry where there's a bad experience, so you think about all the mattress companies that have become very well capitalized and are now a brand like Casper, that's $1 billion company. It's a function of nobody walked into a mattress store and said, man, that was awesome. I got to, walk around and try 30 mattresses. The guy tried to sell me 29 of the 30 and things like that. And then I think you see a lot of businesses where there's kind of the flywheel of data, right? And so whether that's ClassPass or Lyft, you see a lot of businesses where if they can achieve scale, there's real kind of flywheel effects of the data. And then I think the last one is, there's a company in LA called Byrne. It's scooters. I think here in New York City, you guys have jump bikes, which just got bought by Uber. But you see so many businesses that technology kind of gives it that virality and allows it to kind of catch on so quickly. So something like Bird in LA already raised $150 million within less than 6 months. And it just allows that kind of adaptation to happen so quickly because of the capital.
That's awesome, thank you. So why don't we turn a little bit to the discussion of why is it that some of the traditional players kind of couldn't get there on their own or chose not to get there? And maybe Alexa, you've got a bunch of players in the industry that we certainly see as traditional. They've been around for a long time. They must have seen some of this coming. What do you think was missed?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the traditional players in the space, this industry was something that was really ripe for a new opportunity. And you could look at Hallmark and some of the paper, Crane and Company, which is beautiful, letterpress, print business up in Massachusetts. And I think it was just the readiness. They weren't equipped at all. Like, they don't have the technical skills. They don't have the millennials that are working there that have the tech experience. And they weren't structured to actually look at the investments that they had made in things like printing presses as a sunk cost and start over again. Yeah. And then, on the other side of the coin, I think that when the internet came out, and it was fun to watch that clip and have people say, how do you say the A with the circle around it? But, at that time, people were really thinking about the internet as a tool to make people's lives easier, but not something that was attractive. And so the first use cases were like, okay, how can we make money? Ads, right? And I think that a lot of businesses really depended on advertisers for their revenue. So if you start thinking about taking a risk and actually selling directly to your consumer and meeting that consumer's needs, I mean, ads are rarely part of a consumer's need, right? And doing away with sort of your vein of funding, then it's really scary to take that jump, especially if you have a big stake in that game.
In many ways, the ad model had to be disrupted itself,
yeah,
even though that was actually pretty new.
Yeah.
It's a really good story. Michael, you would like to talk about sort of the players in the space, not as competitors, but there were other players. How did they kind of let this go by? They didn't sort of invest behind it. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think nonprofits should be competing to provide the best service to recipients. I think the reality is competition is often a dirty word in the sector. And look, I think there are the classic reasons why the incumbents didn't move as fast as they might jobs, otherwise. I think there are two pretty specific things to the nonprofit sector. The first is that the people that pay, donors, are not the people that benefit and receive the good, the training, whatever it is. And as it turns out, most donors are not very picky. So there's a stat that about 95% of donors don't even look at the website of the organization they give to. They do no research on where they're giving. Now, if you're building a business where you know your customer does not care about the quality of the product, how much are you going to spend on innovation? And what you see, I mean, if you look at the 5 largest for-profit companies in the US, the oldest is Microsoft, which was founded in 1975. It's about 40-ish years old. If you look at the 5 largest nonprofits, the youngest was born in 1910. So there has not been much change at the macro level in this sector, and I think a lot of it can be attributed to the fact that the customer is just not very picky. So if we want to see the NGOs and the sector innovating, I would say the customer should be doing research and picking the one that is doing the most good for the end user.
No, that's great. Really interesting story, and certainly probably a lot of change to come. Byrne, probably, from the perspective of Best Buy, this idea that Amazon was around for a while must have been well known. Curious as to why Best Buy did see change and responded to it, but maybe others did not?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. Everybody always wants to talk to us about Amazon, Paul. So, and what's really interesting about this, many of you probably saw the announcement yesterday. We announced a multi-year partnership with Amazon to produce and sell the Fire TV. And I think the ecosystem is more complex than it's ever been. Our competitors are also partners. Our partners are also vendors. We are becoming a vendor in this partnership for Amazon. And when you think about traditionally, those lines were very defined. Those lines are completely blurred at this point. And if you're not willing to adapt and be open-minded to those changes, you're going to struggle to compete in the future. And I think for us, we've talked extensively internally about having a growth mindset. And if I ask all of you in this room, everybody would say, yes, I have a growth mindset. And when I ask you behaviorally about the things that are actually indicative of a growth mindset and truly embracing change and not being afraid to fail, and when you see failure, adapting and changing quickly as opposed to trying to grind out an idea and make it work, I think those characteristics are really difficult to instill in any organization, let alone a tenured 50-year-old company like Best Buy. We've somewhat successfully, and I say somewhat because those characteristics are not woven throughout the fabric of our DNA at this point, but we have somewhat begun to make that change and have embraced those ideals and those mindsets, and we've let go of some of the paradigms that have driven the first 50 years of our success.
No, that's really, really helpful perspective. Brad, I want to come back to you. You not only brought up pretty big innovation, but you were up against some pretty big players. And not only did you bring this innovation, but you sort of went directly after something that was quite important to them. What was their response? How did that play out?
Sure. So, I mean, the exchange space is a really heavily regulated space. So we grew as kind of an alternative exchange and got so large, we went from the 44th ranked to the 2nd largest in 11 months. But there's a limit to how big a alternative exchange can grow. Exchanges are subject to regulation. In 2014, we applied to become a national stock exchange, which gave New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ an opportunity to really lobby heavily against IX's approval. And it took us 2 years. It was a long, drawn-out fight, and they basically said slowing the market down even by 350 millionths of a second was going to harm investors, despite the fact that pension funds and mutual funds continue to write letters in support of IEX and what we were doing to protect them from high-speed trading. And I think we eventually got that approval. And after lobbying to say that a calamity would be brought upon the market if IEX was approved as an exchange, New York Stock Exchange shortly after turned one of their 3 exchanges into an exchange that had a speed bump. So 2 of their exchanges sold speed, and the 3rd one protected people from the other 2 exchanges and what they sold. what was amazing about that, and they undercut our price by 80%. So they were really looking to run a business at a loss just to try to take us out competitively. What was amazing, and it was a good data point for us, is that that exchange never grew. It's about, we're 10 times the size of that exchange about a year later. And what it comes down to is that over the past decade, we've built an immense amount of trust with the mutual funds, with the pension funds, with these people who have supported us. They saw through New York Stock Exchange's attempt to copy us, and thankfully never supported them, despite the fact that they tried to copy what we were doing. So I think it's, yes, we have technology designed to protect investors. Yes, the SEC forced us to disclose a bunch of this technology as part of this process, which was hard to do, which allowed New York to copy us. But at the end of the day, I think our strongest asset is our relationships and the fact that we took such a huge risk to protect regular investors. I think that was a proof point that it's a differentiator for IX that was the hardest to copy.
That's great, and a good reminder as well that often when we're trying to be many things, we're not really anything, and then the market can't see sort of what do we stand for, and trying to launch lots of competitive products has some disadvantages. It's a great question. By the way, keep submitting questions. It's a really good question to get us going from the audience. I'll start with you, Carter. And this is a question about how do you go about identifying some of these areas where the experience may be bad or technology, as you pointed out, really can have a pretty big difference. I think often we see disruption, we think, oh, there was some genius out there, some random idea someone came up with. Is there some logic to this?
Well, good question. If I had all the answers, I'd probably keep them for myself and not share them. But yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think, so many of these are born from people's personal experiences. So when you think about Casper mattress or Honk the tow truck app, I think you have more and more people just kind of going through life, figuring out kind of what is broken or where they're having a bad experience and kind of taking advantage of it. So I think there's certainly some industries that are more complicated where people are really digging hard, but I think a lot of the good ideas these days are coming out of what seems almost too obvious, but that's what makes them kind of so obvious to another extent.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I'm going to kind of go back to a different topic maybe we were touching on earlier, and that is, what did you have to do to bring something unique to the market? There's one thing to have an idea. It's different to bring that idea to bear in the market with whatever you have to build that's unique that other organizations haven't done. And Alexo, you talked a little bit about this idea that we all have to look good, and you referenced the fact that maybe some of the big players didn't have things like design, but what else had to be done to bring this new value proposition to the market? It's not just a brilliant idea.
Well, I think it's just, I was thinking about what Carter was saying, and I think it actually ties into this. People looking at what your customers really care about, which is different, I think, than looking at what your customers really, like how to make their life easier, right? Because saying that you want to make your customers' life easier is making an assumption that it's an operational challenge or something like that. So when we took a look at really what our customers wanted, we were able to, and we were lean, right? A startup, raise some money on the idea. We were able to configure a team that specialized in that. So we brought together really, really talented design experts, and then we brought together really talented sort of cutting-edge software engineers. And we said, okay, if our value proposition is that we're going to help users create beautiful invitations and help them get people to the events, then what are the key things that the customers are going to value? And we were able to build a design tool from scratch, which is really cutting edge, and also make ourselves an email service provider. So instead of sitting on top of a large third-party ESP, we were able to tap into seeing if someone has opened your invitation or not. Now, this sounds nuanced, but it's what makes Paperless Post addictive. So we're 90% female users. So if the men in the audience are like, oh, I think my wife uses that, but maybe there's some women in the audience that are familiar with Paperless Post. One of the things that's crack about it is that you send out your invitation, and Paperless Post allows you to see if the recipient has opened it or not. And then we give you the tools to say, okay, these people have RSVP'd, I'm going to hound these people. And so people who use Paperless Post go back to it. I think we have something like 50 refreshes a day on the tracking page, seeing, the person opened, but have they RSVP'd? They've opened, they've RSVP'd. So that was really this ability to use our team to tap into these consumer needs. And so, what did we do? We configured the right team, and we could do that from scratch. But what were we really doing? We were saying, what is the physiological and psychological need that we're meeting?
That's really great. It's certainly always more complicated than it seems.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when you're small, you get a chance to really build something new for the first time. Michael, maybe back to you with a similar question. I mean, you had this great insight, and it certainly was new, but I imagine executing it was pretty complex. You had to build a whole network that might not have been there. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what were some of the challenges that you faced, and how did you get past those?
Yes, we had no intent of building a company. I was a PhD student. I didn't know the first thing about building a company. The first thing I'd actually done once we had this insight was call a bunch of organizations to see if we could give them money to simply give to the extreme poor. I thought we'd just find someone and this will be great. It won't be very hard. It turns out nobody was willing to do it. And little by little, took a trip to Kenya, saw if I could do it myself by just giving out money via phone, hired people to see if they could do it, tried to raise capital, and you go from there. I think we stayed true to the values we had and to what we wanted to build, and then went out and saw whether or not people wanted to join us, both in terms of their time, but also their capital. And got some friends to put in money at the beginning, and then actually won a $5,000 essay contest from Unorthodox Philanthropy, where one of the board members pulled out our application and said, "This is the worst thing I have ever seen and will ruin the social sector as we know it." To which Mark Lampert, to his credit, who's gone on to give several $1 million, said, "You know what, let's do this with these folks." And then we spent another year fundraising unsuccessfully until we wound up talking to Google, who was actually really interested in the data and how that was actually changing the nonprofit and social sector. And they wrote us a check at that time for about $2 million, which was a big step up from 5,000. And one of the more stressful moments of the GiveDirectly story of, shoot, what do we do with this? And that's really how it went from there.
That's great. So Byrne, you're dealing with a very large organization. Didn't have the benefits that we heard from Alexa and Michael in terms of, well, it was new, I could build what I needed to exactly right. You had a lot of established practices and policies, yet you were trying to do something new. How did that work in the organization? What kind of things did you have to do that maybe got people to see a new future?
Yeah, I think that's what was nice about the Strategic Growth Office. So with the Growth Office being separate from the core engine with dedicated resources, we pulled people out of their existing roles. I didn't start in the Growth Office. I've been with Best Buy for 20 years, 18 of it in the field, the last 2 at corporate. So new to the corporate environment, but we utilized that smaller team in an incubation type setting to come up with ideas and work through that without the resistance that might have existed within the core engine. Then we worked through partnership to begin to implement the different ideas, the different initiatives, the different work streams with the existing teams, first getting their buy-in, helping them understand how this would impact the core business, how it would impact the company long-term. And that's kind of the approach that we've taken. And that does not mean it's been easy by any means. I referenced paradigms earlier. The paradigms that we hit, the resistance that we hit from time to time is probably the biggest opportunity that we continue to have. But I think that's probably somewhat similar to any large corporation that has a core business the size of Best Buy. So, but the dedicating those resources and combine that with a high degree of executive sponsorship, a CEO that is very dedicated to figuring out how we're going to continue to grow the company, I think those elements put us in a position to compete.
That's great. So Brad, someone actually submitted a question. They really appreciated your comments about the relationships that you had to build. Curious, how did you further enhance those relationships with customers and clients? And what's going to be next? I mean, you've got this amazing innovation, you've grown tremendously, but how do you get the next set of insights and and kind of take it forward.
So, so as far as building relationships, back when I worked at RBC, and we made this discovery essentially that high-speed traders were able to get information to essentially trade ahead of large orders, and exactly how they were doing it within each stock exchange. I remember going home that night, we ran a series of tests. They came back to prove out that this was happening, and feeling like we really discovered something, and then having this kind of thought that said, we weren't the first people to discover this. We're maybe like 10th or 15th, but everyone who had figured this out just went over and became part of the game, became high-speed traders. We made the decision to go out there and educate investors, pension funds, mutual funds. So I think the relationship started back in 2009, just telling the truth, just saying, here's what's going on in the market, here's how we're going to try to stop it. I think the relationship was kind of, I guess, deepened when we quit our jobs to start IEX, because at that point we were taking a lot of personal risk to, again, further this mission in protecting investors. So not only do we say investors come first and we care about clients, but we took a lot of risk. So I think they respect the action probably a lot more than the word. What's next for IEX is that now that we are a stock exchange, finally, we had to apply to become what's called a listings exchange. So right now there are 13 exchanges, there are 45 dark pools, stocks will trade anywhere, but Facebook lists on NASDAQ, IBM lists on the New York Stock Exchange, and they've had a 45-year-old duopoly in doing this. They collect about $750 million in fees from these companies every year, and really what they return back is some nice-looking conference space and some spots on CNBC ringing the bell that not a lot of people are watching. So when you look at it, how have they used billions of dollars of fees to help make this market a better market for these companies? And when you sit back and think about it, companies have a hard time answering that question. And I think the same way we built relationships with investors, we're out there now talking to companies where they realize that this duopoly hasn't really delivered anything of value back to them. And frankly, the exchanges use corporate relationships and the fact that these companies are listed on these exchanges to really influence policymaking in DC. A lot of people ask me, how in the world is this legal? This structural form of insider trading. The exchanges are the ones who have made it such based on the regulations that they look to enforce, essentially using the credibility of the organizations that they're associated with. So I think this is a system that needs to be disrupted from the inside and out. Ultimately, there's companies who need capital, and there's investors who have it. The entire apparatus in the middle is to make it as inefficient to get it from here to here as possible, and the exchanges are right at the center of making that as inefficient as possible to take as much money for themselves. So there's definitely a better way. It's definitely a long fight. And I wish we could face consumers directly, because right now we're in institutional finance. Our biggest clients, thankfully for them, are JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and some other folks, but to get large organizations to do something different is different than trying to convince a consumer to do something different. There's a lot of other banks that really don't want to trade with IEX. So I think it's trying to change that narrative just takes a long time. And being so heavily regulated, and given the fact that New York and NASDAQ have such huge influence, it's a tough battle, but I think we've made a lot of headway.
Yeah, no, that's a great story and also an important lesson about it's not done. And just because a disruption comes doesn't mean we get to some equilibrium.
I think we're in the second or third inning of our battle, which sometimes it makes it hard to get out of bed in the morning, but we're still in the early stages.
So part of this question that came in also gets to this idea of we often study the market rather than really listen to the market. I'm reminded of a story by IKEA. And you may not know this, but IKEA puts cameras in many people's homes to watch how we live our life. Because they don't want to just do market research, they actually really want to see what we're doing. And one of the great stories that they talk about is the fact that at night, before we go to sleep, they were noticing through the cameras that people were pretty stressed out about what they were going to wear the next day. And it was questions like, would it match? Would I be able to find it? Was it clean? Was it ironed? And they said, well, we can solve this problem. We can build a little, hanger and a mirror in someone's room. They put the whole outfit out, and before you go to sleep, you peer over there and you say, I'm all set. And that's an example of really listening directly. Alexa, clearly the company's got a lot of direct connections. What are you doing to kind of listen directly? What are you doing to learn more about where consumers want to go, and what's your future around that?
We do a lot of surveys, and we've found Paperless Post has just over 100 million users, and when people are done sending out a party invite and they're refreshing that tracking page, we serve up surveys. And we have like a 78% response rate. People love to tell us all about their feelings. But it's one of the things so we glean a lot from that, but one of the highest things in demand, which I think would probably affect everyone in this room in their businesses, is mobile. So that is the new frontier for us. You can receive an invitation on mobile, but you can't text them out currently, things like that. And it's hard, how do we build an ESP that allows someone to text an invite and then see if someone's received it? It's just a whole different technology, but it's really where, over the past 3 years, our user base has gone from, I think, 80% desktop to 40% desktop. And so everyone sees this, in their own lives. You're relying on your mobile phone more and more, and businesses that rely on the internet as their whole product are having to revisit how you think about designing an invitation on mobile, sending it, having it received, that whole experience.
Yeah, no, that's great. Michael, I think people are certainly curious kind of what might be next for you and this organization, particularly because you did something really amazingly bold. Love to hear a little bit more about that.
There's a long journey ahead. I think we're also probably in the second inning. I think when we started, people said, this is nuts. The rhetoric has changed pretty dramatically since the previous Secretary General has now come out and said that cash transfer should be the default and the benchmark for humanitarian response where possible. That's a big step forward. The reality is the numbers and the action have not changed. In accordance with that, cash is still a few percentage points at most of the aid that we send each year, which is close to about 130 billion. So we want to change that. I think to change that, you do need to think about the structure of the system you're changing. Right now, and just to use one example, the UN system is structured around kind of mandates that were defined in many cases 50 years ago. So one organization has a mandate for food security. Another organization has a mandate for shelter. So the idea of even giving that mandate to the poor does not fit within the current system. The system does not allow it. So how do you think about changing that at a much larger scale than each recipient that we give to? The one thing that we're doing now that I should add is the first kind of long-term universal basic income, which has been both a popular policy topic, but also obviously something that comes up a lot in the context of labor markets and artificial intelligence.
Oh, that's great. It's really a great story, and I'm sure everyone's going to be looking to see what happens. Carter, maybe some thoughts for the disruptors as well. We talked a lot about advice to the maybe more traditional companies, but as you invest in many, what are some of the challenges they're now having in scaling up and kind of seeing what's next?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you see kind of in all the disruption is basically conditioning consumers, right? And so you talk to somebody like Eric Schmidt from Google. They've had self-driving cars driving around Google's campus for years now. It's taken a while to condition a car. When Uber's self-driving car hit somebody the other day, if any of you had seen the video, it would have been difficult for any of us in this room not to hit the pedestrian, but immediately everyone panics and says, oh my gosh, a robot hit a human being. Yet there was a lot of human beings that same day that hit and killed human beings. And so I think the one thing they're all getting really smart is how do you condition consumers and others, because the pace of innovation is happening so quickly. And so a good example of that is Kitty Hawk. It's Sergey's new company. It's making drones, drone taxis. It was just uncovered in New Zealand. And that's kind of the long-term mission. What they've done to date is they basically have a hovercraft that takes off in San Francisco. They make videos about it. They get consumers to ride it. And as an outsider looking in, what they're trying to do is kind of condition consumers to kind of get used to this type of transport and things like that. And so I think it's kind of the psychology of it, the ability to kind of think differently and condition consumers, and then obviously regulation is going to be a big thing with kind of all these changes happening so quickly.
That's great. We have a question also about kind of advice to get past some of the obstacles, and I think we talked a little bit about that. But I'm going to sort of let Brad answer this question and also Byrne. So from the perspective of kind of the disruptor and the perspective of maybe a more traditional company, what is your advice around getting past some of the challenges? Because you both faced many.
I think for us, the fact that I and many on our team were able to experience and prove out with data the problem that we're trying to solve really gives you the resolve you need to kind of battle through the obstacles. I've testified in front of the Senate. I've testified in front of Congress. I've been, in a lot of different, kind of battles. And, we spent a lot of time in ensuring and understanding that our point of view was the right one. And it was grounded in data. And it gave us a lot of confidence, even at times when, the media is writing one thing that you know to be entirely untrue. The exchanges are lobbying with a false narrative. People are saying things. People are commissioning academic studies that are completely ridiculous. From our standpoint, it's just about knowing the truth, leaning into that, and kind of maintaining that integrity in the things that we do and we say. It helps you get through those times, because a lot of times it will feel like the world's kind of not going the way that you want it to. And you have to have the resolve to realize that you're on the right side of change. It's just not going to have. The one thing I say is I know that this is going to change. What I don't know is when. And I just got to have the resolve and make sure my team has the resolve to see it through until that time comes. It's just not going to happen on our schedule.
Yeah, obviously leadership is a pretty important criteria here and characteristic. Byrne, again, from the perspective of maybe seeing a lot of change happening, a lot of variables in the market, not sure how to respond to advice about kind of how to manage through all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've lived through a ton of different change with Best Buy over the years. We've seen computers come in. When I started with the company, we were still selling VHS tapes. So if you think about that, that's 20 years ago. That's not 200 years ago. But I think when you talk about embracing those components, the thing that I've seen for a company of our size is alignment with the shared vision of what we're working towards. I've seen us as a company have great strategy at various points in our history, strategies that have never worked, because the teams that had to execute those strategies weren't aligned behind why the strategy mattered, what the details of the strategy were, and how to actually get the strategy accomplished. And I think that leadership component of pulling those pieces together and creating a shared vision for the team and making sure that everyone is aligned regarding what we're going to do, specifically when it's change-oriented and we're trying to change a culture that might be ingrained in the organization. I think that's probably the piece that has been most critical for us and where we've had the most leverage.
No, that's great. Really appreciate the perspective. We're just about out of time. I think what we're going to do is play a video for you that kind of takes you back a little bit to this question of how much change is happening and how can you make a bet in a world of change. So let's cue that video.
I very frequently get the question, what's going to change in the next 10 years? And that is an interesting question. It's a very common one. I almost never get the question, what's not going to change in the next 10 years? And I submit to you that that second question is actually the more important of the two. Because you can build a business strategy around the things that are stable in time. And so as you pointed out, in our retail business, we know that customers want low prices. And I know that's going to be true 10 years from now. They want fast delivery. They want vast selection. It's impossible to imagine a future 10 years from now where a customer comes up to me and says, Jeff, I love Amazon. I just wish the prices were a little higher. You know how I love Amazon. I just wish you delivered a little more slowly. Impossible. And so the effort that we put into those things, spinning those things up, we know the energy we put into it today will still be paying dividends for our customers 10 years from now. And so those, when you have something that you know is true, even over the long term, you can afford to put a lot of energy into it.
So maybe before we wrap up, Carter, I'd love to get your kind of response to that. The world of change, lots of disruption, lots of technology moving around. On the other hand, there are some things that we know are probably going to be pretty similar.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I talk about a lot is that everything's just kind of evolving, but not necessarily changing. And so someone said to me the other day, man, I can't imagine not going to a store. And I said, that's really funny. I can't imagine going to a store. Or he said, I can't imagine not driving. And I live in LA, and I said to him, I can't imagine driving. And it's not that, shopping malls are going away or retail's going away. It's just kind of how you think about it or what role it plays in people's lives. And so I used the example the other day with someone that's a big real estate guy. I said, I looked at a fast casual restaurant here in New York City, and 60% of their sales was Postmates, delivery basically. And I said, so they're still going to have a storefront, but the premium they put on where that storefront is, whether it's on the corner or right around the corner, is going to change. And so what I tell people is that the only constant is change, but underlying it, we kind of need the same stuff, but how you kind of think about all those things, I think, is going to be very different.
Great. And for maybe a final thought, Alexa, again, you're sort of in this market of lots of change happening around you. You've done some innovation. What's next? And again, against what's next, how do you know what about your model should stay the same?
Yeah, well, I think people are still wanting to look good. And I did sort of talk about mobile being next. But one of the benefits of Paperless is that every time someone sends one out, we don't have a big external marketing component because receivers say, this is wonderful, and then they use it. And so looking at mobile and thinking about the user experience, we're going to, I think, open a lot of doors in the coming months. If you follow Paperless Post, as we launch these mobile products that will make Paperless, make casual gatherings much more easy as well. So that grows the market size for us. If you're going to meet some old college friends and you don't really care exactly who comes, but you want everyone to know about it, Paperless is going to have the right tools for helping that. So thinking about expanding not just the platform we're on, but the use cases is going to be really important.
Perfect. Well, hopefully this has been helpful for you. Remember that there is a lot of change happening out there. You do have time often to respond, so respond in the right way, working from your advantages rather than just responding to what everyone else is doing. I want to thank the panel. Your comments were incredibly helpful and diverse. Again, really appreciate all of your comments. Thank you.